Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. We have a great episode today with author Kathleen Kent.
Kathleen is a New York Times bestselling author who's written The Heretic's Daughter, The Traitor's Wife, The Outcasts, and her crime trilogy The Dime, The Burn, and The Pledge, plus her most recent novel, Black Wolf.
She's won the David J. Langham Senior Award for American Historical Fiction and the Will Rogers Medallion Award. The Outcasts was named an American Library Association top pick for historical fiction.
Her crime trilogy was nominated for 2 Edgar Awards, and in 2020 she was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters for her contribution to Texas literature.
She's also a writing teacher who leads workshops for aspiring novelists.
The Heretic's Daughter is a story profoundly influenced by Kathleen's descent from accused witch Martha Carrier, who was executed during the Salem Witch Trials on August 19, 1692.
Our conversation with Kathleen covers her writing process, how she learned of her Salem Witch Trials ancestry, and she gives incredible insights for aspiring novelists.
Martha was from Andover, which was the town that had the most people accused of witchcraft during the Salem Witch Trials. In 1690, a smallpox epidemic tore through the town, killing 13 people, 7 of which were Martha's own family members. She was blamed for the entire epidemic. She had just recently moved with her family from Billerica, and so the newcomers to town were blamed for bringing smallpox with them. But during the witch trials, the afflicted people claimed to be visited by 13 ghosts who were screaming that they were killed, murdered by Martha Carrier.
So in May 1692, during her examination, she had a great moment where when they asked if the devil came to her, she turned the question back to them.
Then things got darker. Her 4 children were arrested, and 2 of her sons were tortured until they confessed that their mother had made them witches.
The afflicted claimed that Martha Carrier was promised by the devil to be the queen of hell, and Cotton Mather called her a rampant hag.
These days, she's remembered as a strong, self-reliant woman who refused to confess to something that she didn't do.
Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast, Kathleen Kent. Please tell us about yourself as an author.
Thanks, Sarah. I came to writing relatively late in life. Usually when you're right out of college and you say you're going to be a writer, people say, you go, young person, live your dream. But if you are on the runway to 50, as I was when I started writing full-time, people are not quite so enthusiastic about it because they wonder where you've been. And I spent 20 years after college living and working in New York, first for the chairman of the Commodity Exchange, and then as a contractor for the Department of Defense in the former Soviet Union. So it was very far away from creative writing. I wrote a lot of contracts, which is they want just the facts, ma'am. So I wasn't doing really any creative writing, but I took an early retirement in 2000. I moved from New York to Texas, and I had wanted to be a writer. It had been in the back of my mind, but I needed the time and resources to do it. So when I moved to Texas, my son was a few years old. In 2002, he started school. And so I thought, if I got to the end of my life and didn't try to write the story that became The Heretic's Daughter, I think I would be full of regrets. So I didn't tell anybody but my immediate family that that's what I was doing. I spent 5 years doing research and traveling to New England to write the story, which became The Heretic's Daughter, which is about my 9 times great-grandmother, Martha Carrier, who was hanged as a witch in Salem in 1692. So the way I came to the story was through my immediate family. My maternal grandmother was the one that first told me the story. So I had an idea that that's the story that I wanted to tell. I took 5 years to write it without really any expectation other than trying to get it published and maybe sell a few copies. But it was a story very close to my heart.
Yeah, I find your story so interesting because I started college as an English major with an emphasis on creative writing. I got concerned about the job market, so I switched to business management and
Right.
got stuck in a corporate finance job for like 12 years. I've started writing and I'm aspiring to be published.
Unlike skydiving, you don't particularly want to pick up skydiving or downhill skiing when you're 50. But as long as you can hold a pen or pencil in your hand and hold a thought in your head, you can write. And I think actually having the ability to draw on a life's worth of experience, I think makes you a better writer. It's a deeper well of resources to draw on with your own personal experience. So I'm all for people making the courage to sit down and write what they've long wanted to put down on the page. The story of finding out about my 9 times great grandmother started when I was very young. I grew up in Texas. All of my dad's family was from Texas, but my mother had grown up in a third generation farmhouse in Pennsylvania. Her maiden name was Carrier, and I didn't really know anything about my maternal grandparents. So when I was 8 years old, we took a road trip, my mother and I, to Pennsylvania, and I had the chance to meet my grandparents for the first time. My grandmother Florence was a wonderful woman. She grew up with older brothers in a farming community. She rode wild horses. She was a dead shot with a rifle, and she smoked in public at a time when it was scandalous for women to smoke in public. So I'd heard all these stories about her. I was really looking forward to meeting her. 8 years old, sitting at the family farm table, which was the table itself was probably 150 years old. And I'm sitting there listening kind of half-heartedly to my mother and her mother talking about the family business, catching up on relatives, some of them long dead. And I didn't pay too much attention to what they were talking about until I heard my grandmother Florence say something about an ancestor who was hanged as a witch. And then that immediately caught my attention because being 8 years old, I'd spent several Halloweens dressing as a witch. So I knew what a witch was. So that really intrigued me. So I started talking to my grandmother and asking her questions. And she was really quite knowledgeable about the who, what, when, and where of the Salem witch trials. The Carrier family had very deep roots in New England. And she started telling me about my 9 times great grandmother, Martha Carrier, and the Carrier family, and that she had been hanged as a witch in 1692. And I waited for a pause in the conversation to ask the question I really wanted to ask her, which was Martha Carrier really a witch? There was a little pause, and she said, "Sweetheart, there are no such things as witches, just ferocious women." And that stuck with me. That was like a bell going off in my head because certainly my grandmother was the archetype for a ferocious woman. She was very opinionated. She was very strong willed. She was very courageous. She survived the Spanish flu. She worked all of her life. And she became, I think, a model for me. And so I started asking questions about Martha, about the family. And that began a lifelong fascination with the Carrier family and the Salem Witch Trials. And I realized very early on that what happened in Salem had nothing to do with the supernatural. It was a belief in the supernatural, but it was a confluence of events. It was a confluence of people who were terribly afraid of the plague, smallpox, Indian raids. They were 3 months away from starvation at any given time. Salem Village was a very litigious place when I started diving in and doing research on the village itself. And they were constantly suing each other. And they were not the starched, upright Puritans that the Victorians led us to believe. They were closer to the Elizabethans. They were haughty, bawdy, and wild. They would sue each other at the drop of a hat. They gambled, they drank, they committed adultery. And so I got a really good picture reading the town documents. And of course, as you both know, the court transcripts are extant. They're held in the Peabody Essex Museum and in other places, other universities. And so it gave me, once I became very serious about writing and spent the 5 years researching this project, it gave me a very strong scaffolding, it gave me a very strong foundational story to build factually. And then I could weave in the guesswork of how these people felt as they went through life. And it was a very harsh existence, especially for women. As far as I've been able to tell, Martha Carrier was one of the few, if not the only woman who, when she was brought to trial, stood up to her accusers. And when the magistrates, these very somber, black robed gentlemen, asked her during the trial if she'd ever seen the devil, she said, "The only devils I have ever seen are those of you sitting in judgment before me." So, at a time when women were to be seen and not heard, she was quite ferocious, very courageous, because at the time that she was brought to trial, she understood that the stakes were very high and that she could, if she didn't admit to being a witch, that she would most likely lose her life. So that began many years of research into it. And I was lucky in the sense that the first story that I chose to write my first novel about, had a lot of paper trail that I could follow, and I could read the actual words of the accused, the people, the accusers, the people being accused, and it gave me a very full picture. And in the process of that, I was able to at least summon in my imagination how these people would have reacted during the trials in Salem.
The Carrier family, well, I just want to say the storytelling is definitely in your DNA. You talked about your mother and her mother talking about family, and it really just comes through in your storytelling. But one of the things that I find intriguing about the Carrier experience during the Salem witch trials is there were so many of them suffering together. With some of the other families, my ancestors, you had Rebecca Nurse and Mary Esty. They were together somewhat, but they were really experiencing their own individual accusations. People are coming at them from different angles a little bit. But you had the children of the Carriers. It wasn't just Martha. And you really bring that horrible experience to life, but the beauty of the family bonds. And I just really am amazed by your storytelling. And I'm so glad that you made sure that story got out there.
Thanks, Sarah. I really appreciate it because at its heart, it is a family story. It's a story of family bonds. It's a story of the ultimate sacrifice that Martha made for her family. Because at the time that she was brought in, if you admitted to being a witch, so the burden of proof was on the accused, not the accuser. And like you said, one of the most poignant things about Martha Carrier's family. And there were many cases where family members were accused along with the accused's witch, husbands, children. But I think what's so poignant about the story is that 4 of her 5 children were arrested. Her 2 older sons were tortured in order to compel her to admit to being a witch. But as with in The Crucible, and Miller wrote The Crucible as an examination of the McCarthy Red Scare, the communist scare. It wasn't good enough to say, I'm a communist or I am a witch. Then you were pressured to admit who were your Confederates, who of your neighbors and family were witches along with you. So once you took that leap into saying, I am a witch, I am guilty. Then the pressure intensified for you to name other people in the community. And Martha wouldn't do that. She wouldn't swear false witness against herself, and she wouldn't bear false witness against her neighbor. So they arrested her two older sons, Richard and Andrew, who were about 17 and 15 or 16 at the time. They were brought into the court and they refused to testify against their own mother. In the court transcripts, there's a break. They're removed from the courthouse, and sometime later they're brought back and their story changed. They said, yes, our mother is a witch. And we would not have known why they changed their story, except for the fact that John Proctor, who was jailed at the time, wrote to Governor Phipps and said it is a shameful thing that these boys, these two carrier boys, have been tortured. Because torture, strictly speaking, was not allowed in the colonies, but they had a torture called the bow, which is where it's sort of self-strangulation. And if you didn't admit to your guilt, you would die. You would strangle yourself. So that's what happened to Richard and Andrew. They were tortured and they came back and they said, yes, our mother is a witch. They bring Martha back in and they say, now, are you a witch? And she says, no, I am not a witch. She refused to admit to being it. Then they bring in her two younger children, Tom Jr., who I'm descended from, who was about 10 at the time, and Sarah. And Sarah, the real life Sarah, was only about 7 years old. She was probably the second youngest child to be brought in and accused of being a witch. The youngest one being Dorcas or Dorothy Good, who was 4 years old, and she was arrested with her mother and put into Salem prison. So I made Sarah, for the purposes of narration, I made Sarah Carrier a few years older. She's 9 years old when the novel starts, because I thought a 9-year-old would be a more compelling narrator. And The Heretic's Daughter is told from the point of view of Sarah, the daughter. Also, I picked 9 years of age because in Puritan New England, 9 and 10 was childhood's end. It was the age at which young girls and boys were sent away from their home to learn a craft. They were sent to either a master carpenter or another family, if you're a girl, to learn the responsibilities of keeping a home. And so at 9, it is childhood's end. So I thought that was a good place to start the book. It was a very harsh life. Many women died in childbirth. A lot of children weren't named until they were a year old because the infant mortality rate was so high. So they would wait to make sure that the child lived past infancy, and then they would name the child. So in this backdrop, life was hard enough. But the fact that Martha, even though she knew that 4 of her 5 children, the youngest being Hannah, who was just a baby and was given to the Dane family to take care of while she was imprisoned, she refused to admit to a falsehood. And that kind of courage was so exalting for me to think, because she knew that the end of that journey was going to be death by hanging, and yet she stayed true. And the fact that Thomas, her husband, who was in the public records, known before he became Thomas Carrier, was Thomas Morgan the Welshman. That's how he was registered in the town records. When she died, he never remarried. He was in his 40s when he married Martha. She was much younger than he was. According to family legend, he fought in the English Civil War for Cromwell and was one of the executioners of King Charles I of England. It was expected that a widower, especially a widower with children and grandchildren, would remarry. But once Martha died, he never remarried again. He moved his family to Connecticut. He started a blacksmith forge when he was in his 70s and was quite a unique and remarkable person in his own right. But I thought that the combination of Martha refusing to admit to being a witch, even while her children were tortured and imprisoned, and the fact that Thomas never remarried after her death, I thought were the makings, the emotional grit and heart of the story, and was very inspirational.
I have a question about your writing process. Are you a plotter or a pantser?
That's a very good question because I think I'm a bit of both. Like I said, fortunately, I picked the right project for my first novel because there was so much in place. I had a very strong scaffolding for the story by going to the historical records. So, as a first time novelist, I plotted things out pretty carefully. And then in between the struts of the story, I filled in the emotional motivation as I was moved to do that. So I plotted out the story, beginning, middle, and end. And then I was able to fill in a more organic way, the journey of the story. I've written 7 books to date. 3 are historical fiction, is a contemporary crime novel, and then the last one is a spy novel based in part on some of my experiences in the former Soviet Union. So it's a little bit of both. I will have an outline for the story. For the crime, when I pivoted from writing historical fiction to crime, there's a different pacing involved. And a very accomplished crime writer kind of gave me the best advice. He said, write your beginning and then write your end. Know what the end is. And like a railroad track or an arrow, you can shoot to that, and that will keep you within the confines of your story. So, in that way, the 3 contemporary crime novels were a little bit different in terms of the way I structured the story. But oftentimes, and I'm sure you know this, Josh, that you will have an idea for a strong character, and somewhere in the story, that character is not doing what you had anticipated. It doesn't fit the story the way you had plotted it. You realize in the course of writing it, it's not authentic. It's not true to the character. There's a lot of restructuring that goes on. And some of it is, like you said, plotting, and some of it is just letting the character grow organically. And so I think it's a combination of both.
I really love that insight. And of course, I have just recently read The Heretic's Daughter, so I'm still thinking about that world so much. And Sarah and her character, that it's so interesting to hear about, like, everything about you were able to develop your characters and the story so balanced and compelling. You're just really magnificent at that. And it's wonderful. So I really look forward to picking up some of your other books. You've had a lot of success writing, and I'm so happy about that.
In your writing process, what's the most important thing that you want aspiring writers to know about that process?
This is a really good question. And this is really key to finishing a project. And I've taught writing classes before when I lived in Texas. I taught quite a few writing classes. And one of the things that they want to know is, what is the process? How do you get from beginning, middle to end? And maybe it was my experience of being in the business world, in the commercial marketplace, is that you learn to tolerate a lot of tedium. You learn to tolerate what I call the tyranny of the blank page. Because there are many times, unlike Mozart, who supposedly had these brilliant pieces of music fall on his shoulders entirely of a piece, most people aren't like that. They have an idea, they have a spark of an idea, and it's developing that. It takes discipline and being able to tolerate staring at a blank screen. Because there were times in all of the books that I've written that I spent days not knowing where to go with the story. It just didn't feel right. It didn't feel authentic. It wasn't resonating. And usually I would tell the students, then walk away from it, take a break, read something, watch something, take a walk in the woods, Stephen King had a great analogy. He called it the little men in the basement. That subconsciously, when you're working on a project, the machinations of putting together the story, it's still going on. You may not be fully aware of it, but I would take a long drive or a long walk, and freeing my conscious mind would allow the subconscious ideas to bubble up, and I'd have these eureka moments. And you can't often brute your way through a storyline. Sometimes you have to get up, walk away, do something else. But if it's something that you're emotionally attached to, the story is meaningful to you, it will always come through. Sometimes it takes time. There's some writers, that it takes years. Donna Tartt takes 10 or 11 years to finish a novel. And she goes through many iterations. She goes through many changes, many drafts. As they say, there's no such thing as writing, just good rewriting. So it's encouraging burgeoning writers not to get discouraged if they reach a roadblock, because you are going to reach a roadblock. I would use that oftentimes to do more research if it was historical fiction. I always start with the research and then the ideas blossom out of that. And when I need to, life has a way of interrupting. If you have parents or children, things are going to happen and you have to step away from it. But unlike a loaf of bread, your story is not going to go stale. You just put it on reserve for a while. And if it's a story that you feel emotionally attached to, you can always come back to it and begin anew, begin afresh.
I'm curious, going back to your debut novel, there's so many characters that you're developing at once. Have you kept that pattern through your other stories? Do your stories have a large amount of characters participating?
Yeah, mostly. And they kind of appear in my imagination as the narration proceeds, as the plot line. I'll think what would serve the progression of the narrative, what character. And sometimes the characters appear and I'll write about them and they're not working. They're either too antagonistic, they just don't fit the story. But you can put that aside and you can cannibalize that later if you're writing a series. That character may not work for that book. I have the 3 contemporary crime novels that I wrote. They're all connected, but there were some characters that I thought about in the first book that I didn't bring back in until the 3rd book. It's trusting the process, that nothing is written in stone, literally, and you can move these characters in and out. Do they serve the process of the story? Do they serve in contrast or in collaboration with your main characters? And it's learning to be very forgiving too of yourself, not to be too hard on yourself. Because the truth is, in publishing, you're going to write a story, and if you have a good editor, they will oftentimes come to you and say, this is not working. And that happens. But if you have a good collaboration with an editor, it makes you a better writer. People will say, doesn't it bother you if an editor comes in and they want to mess with your story? They want to finesse the story. And I've always said no. I always appreciate a discerning, critical, in the best possible way, reader. People will say, well, who should be your first reader? First readers are oftentimes not your professional reader. They're people whom you trust, they're friends or family members who are going to reasonably offer some suggestions, but they're going to be kind. Because as you know, in a family contract, in the small print, they have to, right? They have to be kind to you. They don't want to squash your blooming talent. So it's good to have a first reader that's encouraging, especially when you're starting out. But then when it comes time to publishing, you want a really good, discerning, critical reader who will say, this is good, this is not so good, and offer suggestions. And they're just suggestions about how to make the story better. And I've always appreciated, I've worked with some great editors. The second novel in the trilogy, in the crime trilogy, I had submitted it, and one of the most difficult periods of time was when the editor called me and he said, "I love the first half of this book. I love it. I just think it's great. The second half, it's not working. It's just not working." So I had to literally move away the second half of this second novel and rewrite it. And how I did, I had to shuffle things around. I wrote on index cards, each chapter summation, and like a quilt, I moved these pieces around like a board game almost. And so I could see visually what was working and what was not working. So there are all these little things. Again, I think it's good to accept the fact that manuscript that you turn in that you say is finished is not finished. It has to be perfected and polished and finessed. And the trick is finding the editor. It's like a good dance partner. They follow your steps without interrupting the dance. And that's always a good thing to have, a good editor.
Can you tell us what a typical writing day is like for you? Or do you sit down and write at a specific time of day? Do you have any advice for other writers on how to tackle the day?
I think everyone is different. Some people write well at night. That's when their creative juices flow. I know some writers, one writer in particular, that would go to sleep and then wake up with his hair on fire. And that's when he would write, because that's when the floodgates opened. It really is when you have the energy to sustain your imagination. For me, that's the morning. Having a cup of coffee, going in, closing the door, turning off the phone, writing in the morning. And usually, after about 3 or 4 hours, rarely does it go more than that, because that's when I'm the sharpest, and it's an enormous amount of concentration and effort into creating the story. It's like playing four-dimensional chess, because you're moving so many pieces around. You're moving characters, you're moving plot, and so, that's when I feel the most energetic, is in the morning. I have a very good friend named Joe Lansdale, who's a wonderful writer. He's written so many great novels, mostly about Texas and about the Old West. He only writes 2 or 3 hours a day, but he's incredibly prolific, because he said after 2 or 3 hours, he runs out of steam, and then he's working against his own imagination at that point. So if your peak time is 2 or 3 hours, then that's what you should do. When you feel like you're having to, when it's work, when it's really work, then that's the time to step away. Maybe come back to it, or maybe wait till the next day. So I'll write 3 or 4 hours, and that's my peak. And then I'll maybe go away and do more research or read somebody else's work that's inspiring to me. That is just how I work.
That's wonderful. And what's the name of the crime series?
Oh, it's called the Detective Betty Riz crime series. And there are three. It's the Dime, the Burn, and the Pledge. And they're all three connected, but you can read each one as a standalone. That's the key to writing a good series, is that you could pick up any one of the books and be filled in with what happened previously without being too cumbersome about it. Going back to Martha being a ferocious woman, I worked in the commodity exchange for 10 years, and I worked for the Department of Defense for close to 10 years as a contractor in the former Soviet Union and Belarus and Kazakhstan. Many, many times I was the only woman in the room. I got very used to pushing back against the status quo and against the opinions of primarily men. So that built my ferocity muscles, if you will. So I love the idea of strong, competent women who push back against the system, so to speak. The series came from a short story that I wrote. I was challenged to write a crime story for an anthology called Dallas Noir. And Betty Rizek just kind of appeared like Venus from the sea. And I thought, I wanted to do a police officer. And what could I do that was the most contrary, the most rebellious character? Betty Rizek is a cop from New York. She comes from a family of cops. She's moved with her girlfriend to Texas. She's 6 feet tall, redheaded, and a lesbian. And I thought, what could be more contrary than that, especially in a Texas law enforcement agency? So I started there, and everything that she did and as she evolved was in opposition, was in resistance to the status quo, and she had to fight for her agency. So I was able to kind of challenge my own personal challenges into that character, which was very satisfying. I think I confused a lot of my historical fiction readers because they were used to reading about 17th century New England, or as in The Outcast, Texas after the American Civil War. But I gained a whole new, I guess, readership from that, people that love crime stories. And I think part of the success was that she was so different. She wasn't this hard-nosed, hard-shelled gumshoe. And I picked Dallas because crime series often LA, Chicago, New York. These are the playing grounds of the gumshoes of yore. So I wanted to take a city. Dallas was voted many years as being one of the most beautiful skylines. Dallas is a very wealthy city. It has as many plastic surgeons as Los Angeles. They spend more money on lawn care than they do in Bel Air. It's a very pretty city on the surface, but below the surface are some very ugly things. The drug trade, sex trafficking trade. So I wanted to kind of expose and break through this pretty facade of Dallas. And it was really fun. It was really a fun series to write because of Betty. She was a force of nature, and to take on Dallas and to expose some of the things that didn't appear on page one in the Dallas Morning News.
What do you hope that people take away from the experience of reading one of your books?
I hope that the readers take away inspiration from the strong, especially strong female characters. You know, they say nice women don't make history. And I love books with strong female characters. I love strong male characters too. But having an emphasis on a strong female character, I hope is inspirational. I hope that it is provocative, because some of the best fiction pokes the bear, and I really enjoy that. And for me, it was a way to, well, the first couple of novels was a love letter to my family. And that's, Isabel Allende said, we must write about things that must not be forgotten. And that's especially true, I think, with historical fiction. We write to revisit what we were like hundreds of years ago. And really, we haven't changed in 2,000 years. Technologically, we have, which has changed our neurology somewhat, but emotionally, we're exactly the same. And I think making that connection to the past, we learn from the mistakes of the past, hopefully, and we can show a mirror to present day. And I think, what you're doing, Josh and Sarah, is really important in terms of talking about the idea of the witch has been a long time, many hundreds of years, many thousands of years, an object of ridicule, an object of fear, an object of prurient sexuality. And it's this desire for women to reclaim their agency, to reclaim their power, which I think is so important, and which today we're having to struggle. Unfortunately, we're having to struggle diligently to make sure that we don't lose any more ground. And I think that reading about stories, fiction, and again, Isabel Allende said that writing fiction brings the truth to the lies we're writing. There's a greater truth that can come forward through that. And I'm dismayed at this. I'm 72. I mean, I've lived a long life. I've had different careers, and I am very dismayed by the acceptance of the diminishment of women and the loss of autonomy and the loss of the voice. And I hope that through my characters, it can give a voice to women that would ordinarily be silenced. And there's that song, I'm my mother's savage daughter. I won't cut my hair. I will not silence my voice. So I think through what we read, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I especially want to portray women as courageous, like Martha was. She was so courageous. She never admitted to being a witch. She stood fast in her own truth and lost her life because of it. And she has been an inspiration for me my entire life. And so that's what I hope that the readership takes away from these stories.
Do you think female authors right now feel pushback from editors or publishers or critics when they give such power to their characters and stories?
The publishing world right now is really in disarray. I published my book, the first book, Heretic's Daughter, in 2008. And it was a year or two later when Amazon came on the scene and completely upended the traditional publishing process. Now, the old boys club, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing that that was upended because we didn't have the voices of women, especially in crime fiction. We didn't have the voices of people of color, indigenous, Black, Latino. And this upheaval opened the door for more diverse voices to shine through. However, with the loss of sources that you could go to, I mean, you could go to the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune and read reviews of books and go, oh, that sounds like a good book. That has been completely disrupted. So you have to go a lot of times by word of mouth. Book clubs are a really good source for that. I think the two categories that sell the best, that are marketed the best, are YA fantasy fiction, which is great, which is really good because a lot of young people are reading books. That's Game of Thrones type of The Fourth Wing and that type of stuff, which is great. And then romance. So I don't write strictly in either of those categories. So I've kind of taken a break from novel writing. I've pivoted to screenwriting. And I've written several screenplays, one of which, the most recent of which, is being considered by several production companies. It's a ghost story, takes place on a remote Scottish island. It's a woman's revenge story with a tinge of the supernatural. So the themes are still there. I've just switched to a different platform. I think we're living in very difficult times. People's ability to concentrate. I know people, very good friends of mine who have been avid readers say, I can't concentrate. So I watch Netflix or I watch movies or I watch things that are more of a visual nature. So just as a writer, I've pivoted to that. That's not to say that I won't go back to novel writing, but it's been difficult for conventional novelists to sell their product. I hate to put it in those terms, but that's how the marketing team looks at it, to sell their books to legacy publishers. Now, there are a lot of independent publishers, smaller publishers that are good, but it's really hard. It's like yelling into the wind. How do you find a foothold in that? And it comes back to you write because you love it. You write because you love the story, you love the characters, and you can't not write about it. So it really has to be a love letter to whatever story you're committed to.
Thank you so much for everything you've shared with us today.
I really appreciate the time that you've spent with me and asking the questions about not only about the story, like The Heretic's Daughter, but the process of writing. I think we need artists now more than ever. Commercializing that art is a whole other topic, but we need artists, we need music, we need plays, we need books, we need things that uplift and inspire people because I think, as a student of history, this too shall pass. What's happening presently it's cycling through. I like to think of it as an extinction burst. Things heat up when the star is imploding. And I think it's the art that helps carry us through dark times. It's the art that helps remind us that we are a very small speck and that things do come in cycles. And it's also a way, it's a fellowship, being with other writers, being with readers who appreciate things and are in conversation about those books or about art makes us feel we're not alone in the dark. There are other people like us, and it gives us the courage to carry on.
Thank you for joining us for this author talk episode of The Thing About Witch Hunts.
What an inspired episode for writers. If you've been working on a writing project, this is your cue to keep up the great work.
I know this episode inspired me to do some writing and keep pushing to that finish line. And I hope it's done the same for you. For more information on our guests, visit KathleenKent.com. And have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow and happy holidays and a heck of a new year.